Welcome. My name is Ron Allen, speaking through the auspices of West Street Christian Church and saying to you, as they said in the time of Jesus, Kalimera, that is, Kale, beautiful, good, things working together, Hemera, day, good day. This is the fourth in a series of inspirational studies of the Gospel of Mark under the title Emergency Literature, the Gospel of Mark for Times Like This. Emergency because Mark wrote this gospel about the year 70 after the Romans had despoiled the temple and Judaism had begun to collapse. Within this setting, a generation removed from Jesus, Mark told the story of Jesus again with an eye toward helping the community navigate its way through that emergency time and live with hope toward the future. Last time, we focused on the immersion of Jesus, the descent of the Spirit, the voice from heaven, on the one hand, bestowing identity on him, you are my son, and on the other hand, implying mission, that like the king being elevated, like the prince being elevated to the throne, Jesus was now elevated to the role of agent, witnessing to God's great transformation from the old to the new. Next time, we'll focus on the most important verses in the Gospel of Mark, and after that, on Friday, the call of the first disciples. So we come to the text right now that begins, and the Spirit immediately drove him out into the wilderness. He was in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild beasts, and the angels ministered to him. The first thing I want to call to your attention is the agency at work here. The Spirit drove him into the wilderness, and in Greek, it's an infinitive of purpose, in order to face off with Satan. There is a very important principle here, and that is that the Spirit does not wait back for Satan to make the first move. The Spirit takes the initiative because the message of Jesus, the work of Jesus, the transforming work of the realm of God is so important that it takes the lead. It does not wait for things to develop. It moves out, even when confrontation is ahead. So the Spirit drove him out into the wilderness. I've talked about the wilderness already as a place that is bare, where life is on the edge. In those days, they believed that the wilderness was the haunt of demons, and yes, it was a place where Satan dwelled. Not the only place, but a place where he would come into stark relief against the semi-arid conditions all around. This is also Mark's way of saying that the time in which Mark was living was a kind of wilderness. It was a kind of liminal time when things were on the edge, when survival was uncertain, when there were threats in the community in which Mark lived, in the same way that there had been threats in the wilderness when Jesus went out there. Sound familiar? Seem a lot like our time, a wilderness time? And he was there 40 days. 40 days is one of those symbolic numbers that really means a very long time in which some of God's purposes were taking place. For example, Noah in the ark, 40 days and 40 nights. Children of Israel, 40 years in the wilderness. Jesus here, in this tradition, 40 years in threat, for 40 days in threat, when who should he come eyeball to eyeball with but Satan? Now, let me pause just a moment over the figure of Satan to say that in the first 39 books of the Bible, while the word Hasatan does occur a handful of times, it never occurs in reference to someone who is God's direct nemesis. In fact, in the book of Job, as in some other places, the figure of the Satan in the Old Testament is actually in God's employ, rather like a prosecuting attorney. But by the time we get to the Gospel of Mark, many Jewish people had come to believe that there was such antagonism to the purposes of God in this old age, that there was such an impetus to sin, so much injustice, so much violence, death, the final word on every living thing. There was so much of this that it must have come from a single derivative source. And so they began to speak of Satan as the exact opposite of God and as an entity who, having fallen, wanted to wrestle control of the world away from God. And this is exactly the meaning of temptation. What did Satan do when he tempted Jesus? He tempted Jesus to give up on God and on the things of God and on the ways of God. He tempted Jesus to give up on the identity that God had just bestowed on him in baptism and to turn away from the mission that Jesus was given by God, which, as we shall see next time, is to announce that the great transformation, the realm of God, is already at work, which means an end to the rule of Satan and all of the values and qualities of life that go along with Satan. Satan offers Jesus what Satan thinks will be an easier way. And this, too, scholars tell us, is a clue to the function of this story, not just in the Gospel of Mark, but in the church to which Mark wrote. And I will say to you, also to the church we are today. Satan knows that there will be conflict ahead, because as Jesus announces the coming of the realm of God, Satan and his henchmen will entrench themselves, fight back, and there will be conflict between God and Jesus and Satan and the demons. And Satan is here offering Jesus the opportunity to turn away from this conflict and to join with Satan and his ways of being in the world. Jesus, having been strengthened by the 40 days of spiritual dedication, being in the wilderness and yet being sustained by God, refuses the temptation. Mark says, the wild beasts were with him. After the fall, when enmity broke out between humankind and nature, and especially between humankind and the animals, there was a kind of struggle for superiority, and especially as human beings used the animals for their own benefit. But now, in the presence of Jesus, temptation successfully turned away. The wild beasts are in support of Jesus. And not only that, but Mark says the angels ministered to him. with Satan in his face, in the drama of the wilderness, the angels, God's agents of providence, come to Jesus' aid. Now, I noted yesterday that many scholars think that the immersion of Jesus is a model or an example for what Mark believed would happen to people when they were immersed, and what we believe happens when people are immersed. And I would say the same thing about the story tonight. The temptation is a kind of model or example for Mark's church and for us, because in Mark's world, Mark believed that his congregation, living a full generation after Jesus, continued to come eyeball to eyeball, face to face, tooth to tooth with Satan, especially in the form of people through whom Satan was acting in Mark's world. And this text is a way of Mark saying to his community, when you face into this kind of conflict, you will be tempted, as Jesus was, to take the easy way out. You will be tempted to settle for the way things are. And when you do that, you are just colluding with Satan and promoting values and practices that work against God's purposes for you and for the whole community. This is Mark's way of saying, don't settle. Don't settle for the way things are. Always look for where God is already taking the initiative. Always look for where the Spirit is propelling you and others toward the values, the practices, the ways of God. And when you do that, even if it brings you into conflict, there will be a new harmony around your life, like the wild beasts being with Jesus. And in the very depth of temptation, the angels will provide the support that you need, a support that comes from a living God.